12. This is the last lecture certainly, but not one of the most interesting ones. One of the most interesting ones. Why? Because it involves CSS. What will be our web pages without CSS? You remember the web pages in 2000s era? It was dull, blocky, and so unattractive to the eyes. But with CSS, we have all these flashy graphics and flashy buttons, YouTube, and everything else, which is interesting and which makes our internet more attractive and appealing. Mr. Hakon is the inventor of CSS as well as Opera. Opera is one of the most user-friendly browsers that I have ever used, and trust me, it has lot of things that other browsers do not offer. To say that Mr. Hakon is only a computer science person, it's wrong. He's also an activist who actively fights organizations such as Microsoft and the governments for issues that are inherently impacting our day-to-day lives. For example, he has actively fought against high rises in his home city of Oslo. And Mr. Hakon has been a recipient of several awards. The most notable one would be the one offered by MIT Technology Review, TR100 in 1999, naming him as one of the top 100 innovators. And Techfest 2012 is very honored to have Mr. Hakon here with us, and I would request all of you to give him a huge round of applause. I would request an organizer to give a bouquet showing the appreciation by Techfest 2012. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored to be here today. I don't know you all, personally at least. I'd like to get a little sense of where we are when it comes to CSS, for example. I assume that you have heard about this topic since the person introducing me was so kind to speak kindly of it. But do you know what it stands for? Okay, great, that's perfect. And then this one? Excellent, you did very well. Okay, now how many have heard about the Opera browser? That's all. How many of you have it in your pocket, Opera Mini? That's perfect. More than half, 75%. I'm a very happy man already. Okay. Let's go on. So, this is me a few days ago. I'm from Oslo, Norway, and I was up in the mountains where we have snow now. And this is me on my way to the airport, actually. Well, not actually. I'm joking. Sometimes I make a few jokes, and then you're allowed to laugh, okay? But still, I'm going to talk about something very serious. So it's not all fun and jokes. I'm going to be talking about the web. The web is very dear to me, and I think to most of you as well. Many of you may not remember 20 years ago when we didn't have the web. The web has changed our lives. It varies a little bit where you are on this planet, what kind of technology you have access to, but we're seeing that the web plays an ever more important role in our lives. We trust the web with our money, we do banking on the web, we trust it to get dates, we trust it to have newspapers. What used to be on papers is now increasingly on the web, and we also get to know our friends better through Facebook and other things. I'm not going to be speaking so much about the services and the things we build on top of the web. I'm going to be speaking about the technology underneath, the CSS, the JavaScript, and the HTML. And I think those building blocks are very important. They are the ones that allow others to build the kinds of services that we're seeing booming all over the world. So I'm going to be quite technical, but still I'm going to start with the beginning and give it a little bit of history, see where we're coming from, and also see where we're heading, what kind of stuff we can do with the web tomorrow. So this is another picture with a man in it. Here's the man. And this is the world's biggest machine. This is from CERN, a physics laboratory in Europe. You may have heard about it. It's been in the news recently. when they discovered, you know about this? You're great. You know it all. And this is the place where this man, Tim Berners-Lee, invented the web about 20 years ago. He started the work about 22 years ago, and in August 1991, the first web server was turned on. So that's a little more than 20 years now. So the web is no longer a teenager. The web has reached 20 years, but it's still quite a young thing compared to where we want it to go. I think we want the web to live for a very long time. So there's still work to do. There's still some things that we need to make sure we can get working in the web. But Tim did a fantastic job. In a period of 2 years, he invented the HTTP protocol, the URL, the concept of a URL, the web addresses, and the HTML language. And then from then on, he went on to start organizations like W3C, who are responsible for coordinating technical development of the web. I was fortunate enough to be able to work with him at CERN. I shared office with him there for a while. And one of the things we did in the web group at CERN was to set up the first public web terminal. And here's a picture of it. I'm not a physicist. You know, most people at CERN deal with physics. And that's probably something, you know, very interesting for physicists in the pipes over there. We were more concerned about the computers. There's so much data coming out of these machines at CERN, data that needs to be analyzed. So they have a huge computing department and have a strong tradition in computing. And Tim was working in the computing department when he invented the web. His goal was to make it easier for scientists to communicate with each other. So one natural thing to do was to set up, when the web was invented, was to set up this public web terminal where people could just come and walk by. This was in the corridor, and sit down and try this new thing out. So here's one more picture from that place. World Wide Web, you click, we do the rest. That was the slogan we used. And I think we can conclude here and now that it wasn't due to marketing that the web succeeded. The marketing was actually pretty poor, but it worked because the technology was there and we were able to reach content that was interesting. So I have a little personal theory of mine. These pipes again, I don't know what's in them, but I have a personal theory that he had to walk past this place on his way to the office every day, right? So as if he goes there, and he's working on the HTML language, right? You know HTML? It has H1, H2, H3, you know, 1, 2, 3, and then you have all these other guys. That's good. You laughed in the right place. You're a good audience. So HTML is a very simple language. It's something you can teach a person basically in 15 minutes, I think. It's easy to tell them that this is a headline, and the headline starts with H1. That's kind of a computer code, but okay, it's easy enough to understand. And these brackets, they don't look so pretty, but they're there, and we can see that it separates the tag here from the content. And then we have the slash that indicates this is the end of it. You know, I used 20 seconds to explain that. And if you add a couple more minutes for the other tags, you can pretty much explain to somebody how HTML works. It's a very simple structure. It has a little bit of semantics. It's semantics, the fact that something is a headline. So it says something about the role of that text, about the meaning of that text. But it doesn't say anything about how to present it. It doesn't say anything about which color you wanted to have it. It doesn't even have to be a visual presentation. This is a semantic presentation that can be read out loud to a person who's blind, perhaps, or if you're shown on the computer screen, which most of us uses. So I think that's really a great invention. It's a fantastic invention. The first web pages that were used, that were written, looked like this. So although we love the simplicity of HTML, we may not like, at least by today's standard, this is probably what people would say, it's a pretty boring presentation. This is a screenshot from Mosaic, one of the first web browsers. Are there any Mosaic users? Have any of you used Mosaic, actually? None. None. Yeah, it's a long time ago. So this kind of presentation, this was before we had images even on the web. There was only text, and there was hypertext, but that was important. But it doesn't really make for a very exciting presentation. So when authors came to the web, to that early web, they really wanted to make more exciting presentations. Many of them came from desktop publishing, where they had been able to select fonts and select colors and do layout. And they wanted to do that on the web as well. But then they saw HTML and say, I can't do it. There's no font tag here. You know, how can I select the font? How can I set the colors? The tags aren't there. We need to do something about that. We need to invent a font tag. Or we need to make images out of content. If I make an image and I put the text in there, then I can control everything. I can control the layout, fonts, everything. So we were seeing a development where the web was turning to be almost a fax machine. You know fax machines? Yeah. You remember them? You still use them? Maybe so. You know, the fax machine takes a picture of the text and sends over the picture. And that's not so smart, because once you just have the picture, you can't do so many smart things about it. You can't search it, for example. There's no way to index that text once it's been photographed into an image. So we were seeing a threat that HTML might turn into something that it wasn't meant to be, something that's very image-oriented as opposed to text-oriented. So some of us said that we need to be able to give authors what they want while still preserving the semantics of HTML. We need to be able to make beautiful web pages that still can be indexed. And one of the inspirations for the work I started, which ended up being CSS, was this beautiful landscape that you can find outside of CERN. CERN is in Geneva, on the border between Switzerland and France. And on a good day, you can see the Alps in the background. This is Mont Blanc here. Fantastically beautiful area. You have the city of Geneva here in the middle, and you have the vineyards of France here in the front. And this is something that we as humans can relate to much more than text, black and white text on a piece of paper. We're much more visual in the sense that our perception likes to see beautiful pictures. This is turning the camera. This is not the Alps. This is the Jura Mountains. Geneva is kind of in this valley, and here you have these cows that are grazing happily in the field. I've seen some cows in Bombay too. They seem to have just as good time as the cows here. These are happily grazing without knowing there's a big machine underneath them. You know, the CERN is underground, where these particles go in a circle. So, in order to make sure that HTML could remain a semantic language, we came up with the concept of CSS. So, one of the big secrets actually of CSS is it's not about making fancy presentations. It's really, the most important thing about it is to save HTML. Still, we like fancy presentations too. This is not very fancy, this is very simple. Here we're just saying that, whoops, I made a mistake here. You see the mistake? It should have been H1. Yeah. Sorry. But do you know what it means? It means to set a font size on the element, I set a color, and I set text alignment. And these are some of the building blocks, these are some of the properties that CSS1 started to offer people around 1996. That's when we had the first implementations of CSS. But it still would take years before this became usable. Now CSS is at a stage where you can take a boring looking document written in HTML, you can add a style sheet to it, and you get a very different kind of presentation. So this is exactly the same HTML code, we just added a style sheet, and just by changing the style sheet, just by changing a reference to a CSS file, you get a very different presentation of this one document. So CSS has become one of the cornerstones of the web, one of the foundations, along with HTML and JavaScript. CSS has become one of the technical foundations of the web. I don't know, did many of you hear the previous speaker about MP3? Yeah, because I think he's also done very important work in terms of making a technical specification that has become a foundation. I think one key difference between the work that was done in MP3 and the work that was done in web was that the web stuff was never patented. Tim Berners-Lee never patented HTML or HTTP. I didn't patent CSS. And Brendan Eich, who did JavaScript while working for Netscape, he didn't patent it either. These are languages that are freely usable for anyone. Nobody needs to pay to use these languages. I had a brief chat with Mr. Brandenberger about that, and I think we agreed to disagree on this topic. He thought patents was important because that allowed his work to go on at Fraunhofer. I think it was great for the web to just let it out open. Let's make sure that everyone can use this without paying any entrance fees. So let's go a little bit more into CSS. And again, we'll start with the simple stuff and then move to more advanced things. Here's some text. And we can, by adding CSS properties on this text, you can see the code up here. Then we can change the presentation of that text. I should tell you, before I get too far, that I'm using the HTML to give this presentation. I'm using a special mode in Opera that allows me to present this HTML document. This is HTML, and when I press the magic button, I go into the presentation mode in Opera. So I'm using a browser to show you how this works. So I can set the font size, I can set the font style, I can set the font family. You know these things because you've been dealing with this, obviously. And this is, quite simple stuff. And it still allows designers, in the hands of the right designers, they can create quite interesting pages with this. And different from using images is that they can do this while we can still have the text. We can still select the text here. And when Google gets to these pages, or other search services gets to these pages, they can still index it because we still have the words behind it, even though the presentation looks like something that could come out of Photoshop or some other image manipulation program. This is text shadow. This is one of the more advanced properties. It hasn't been used that much because Microsoft Internet Explorer 4 didn't implement it. Now it's implemented by everyone. So you can see you can create those 3D-like shadowy effects just with a single line of CSS code. You give it an X and a Y and an offset, sort of a blur, a shadow width, and you set a color, and then you get this. So it's very easy to change this. This is one line of code. If you need to change that text shadow from pink into something else, you just change that one line of code. Instead, if you had been using Photoshop for that, you'd have to go in and change all the images again. And if you were to translate that website into something else, you'd have to create another set of images for it. So another way of looking at CSS is that it's there to stop you from using Photoshop. And I'm not saying that against Adobe. It's really about images. But Adobe have been so good about Photoshop that it's become what you think of when you talk about image manipulations. Here's another one which is barely visible. I'm actually giving it a white. I'm giving it a white text color, so it shouldn't really be visible if it hadn't been for that text shadow which has been put on it as well. So that's kind of where CSS is at the moment. It's widely supported by all browsers. But then we want to do more stuff. There's been requests for more things. One of the first things designers started asking for once they become accustomed to the concept of CSS is, I'd like to do rounded borders. And I said to them, this was in the mid-90s, I said, no, nobody does rounded borders anymore. I'm not sure about the fashion in India at the moment, but at least this kind of design was typical for Europe in the 70s. And I said, rounded borders, that's really so 70s. Nobody's doing that anymore. But they came back and back and back again and said, we really need rounded borders. So, okay. We did rounded borders. Now this is also widely supported in browsers. And I've actually come to the conclusion that, yeah, it's pretty cool. It's not just about making everything round like this one. You can just, by changing, again, we're changing one line of code, we're giving it a horizontal roundedness as well as a vertical roundedness. Then you create a very different visual presentation of that border. And here again, just by setting the roundedness in two corners, not in the two other corners, you have a very different presentation. This is, visual fluff. It's not important at all. It's only about presentation. It doesn't change any of the text. It doesn't change how it's indexed in Google or how you can find the document. It's only about the visualness. But I don't think we should disregard that. It's very important that these web pages look good. And it's also very important that we can do both things. We can both do the semantics and we can do the presentation. And that's what HTML and CSS is about. Text shadow, very cool. You can add this to any box. It's like box shadow. It's like text shadow. You can add a little bit of fuzziness, just like we did with the text shadow. You can make it look like it's sort of been spray painted on the sides there. And then you can add one keyword. Did you see that? I added the inset keyword, and the shadow turned from outside here to inside. It's just a little switch, and it's a very different presentation again. So what can we use this for? What's the use of this? Well, when you go to apple.com, for example, I haven't checked Apple's India site, but if you go to the Norwegian or the American one, you have this menu at the top, which looks pretty good. But it's all done in images. And that's something I take as a challenge. I'd like to replace the use of images. Here's a little blow-up. You can see what it's made of. You can see that it has a little bit of roundedness, has a little bit of shadow underneath. The search field here is rounded. Again, there's a little bit of shadow to give it kind of a 3D feel. And you have a little bit of white underneath the letters. Again, to give it a kind of a 3D look and feel. So, how can we do this? Can we do this in CSS? The answer is yes. Here is the same menu, basically done in HTML and CSS without the use of any images. I can select the text here. So what have we done? Basically, I've done exactly what I showed you in the previous example. I've added a little bit of box shadow. I combined it with a little bit of border radius, a bigger border radius on this one, with the inset shadows to give it this. And here's text shadow on these letters here. So by combining these techniques, and it's not one line of code anymore, maybe it's 10 lines of code, you can create quite advanced visual presentations. And Apple doesn't have to send those images over the web anymore. We can make much more compact sites that transfer more easily to our phones. We don't want to transfer images to phones. They take up too much space, it's too expensive, it's much too long time to wait for. We'd like for this to be compact and quick, and here are the solutions. So I said there was no images here. I'm actually lying to you. There is one image here, the Opera logo. See that? But wait, I can show you. This is the Opera logo done entirely in CSS. Whoa. Yeah? You see the rounded borders, you see the shadow effects here. This is done, I wouldn't call this simple. This is not 10 lines of code. I can show you the source code even. This is maybe 100 lines of code, And it's probably about 10 elements. You can't do it in one element. You have to have sort of a series of elements, and you style them differently, and that's how you make these layers. So it's not something I'd like to recommend you doing, but it's still cool to see that something like this is possible. Okay, now we're moving on to another subject, which is also going to change how web pages look, and this is web fonts. In 1995, Microsoft did something incredible. They released a set of high-quality fonts for use on the web. And not just for Windows computers, but also for Mac and Linux. Because they said, we'd like to contribute to the interoperability of websites. We'd like for these fonts to be installed on every computer there is. And we're therefore giving them out for free. Incredible project. It's probably the best thing Microsoft ever did. And still, most of the pages we're looking at least where I come from, in Norway, are using one of these fonts. They're still of high quality, but we're getting a little sick and tired of them now, probably. We'd like to have more fonts at our disposal. So a few years ago, I started a campaign to have browsers support the web fonts. We had that spec'd out in CSS2. CSS2 was released in 1998. The problem in 1998 was that there was no font format that was universally accepted. That changed a few years into the 2000s when TrueType established itself for you, and we had a lot of people generate public domain TrueType files. So by pointing the style sheet onto those files and referencing them from CSS, we could then create presentations that use these other fonts. And I've taken some fonts from a German designer called Steffmann. He's made these available for anyone to use. And by importing a style sheet that has the references to his files, I can use the common CSS property, just say font family Angel, and I can use this Angel font. And this font is very decorative. He has hundreds of these examples. And it's basically one-liners in order to use them. You probably don't want to use this font for, everything you do. You don't want to, if you write your CV in this font, I'm not going to read it. But it's very good if you're going to do a birthday invitation, something special. If you want some visual variety on your pages, it's great to be able to point to these font files and to use them. So there's a bit of visual fluff in that as well. But it's more than that, though. This is a message that was sent out on one of the Wikipedia mailing lists just before Christmas, a few weeks ago, where they describe how they're using web fonts in the Wikipedia project. So the important part here, which is especially relevant for India, is that they say they're using, in 40 wikis, in 11 Indic languages, have started to use web fonts. I don't know these, I can't read these languages. I don't know if fonts were available for them. Probably they were. Maybe they're using web fonts to get better quality fonts. I should look into this. Maybe some of you can tell me about this. But I went online this morning and I think this is Hindi, right? Thank you. So this is what the web page looks like in the beginning. The first split of a second. When the HTML code and the CSS code has been downloaded, then Opera tries to display it, but it doesn't have the font for some of the text, right? So this is before Opera has downloaded the font. It looks like this. And when the font comes, it shows up. This was a split of a second later. So this shows how web fonts can be used to, not just for fluffing up English, but be used for languages that are non-Latin based, languages that may not have that much usage. I mean, I'm not talking about Hindi, you have billions of people using, but some of the other ones, this is something else. You got it, okay, and this one? Bengali? Bengali. Do we agree? It is Bengali? Yes. Thank you. So I'm very, very, very excited about this kind of development. And I think for some of this is just a start for Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia is one of the most important projects that we have at this time. And they will do wikis for very small languages in the future. And the fact that we can use web fonts to support them better, I think makes the world a better place. Okay, moving on. Transitions. This is very cool. I can, just by setting 2 lines of code here, I can make this image, which happens to be the shield of Norway. I can make him spin around. I'm probably violating some Norwegian law that says the lion has to be up there and shouldn't spin around. But you're not going to tell him anyone, right? So again, it's very simple. I'm using a little bit of SVG, that's scalable vector graphics. It basically describes this as a vector graphic instead of a bitmap. Then I'm saying that the transition effect that I'm describing should take 1 second. So it takes 1 second for the line there to spin. And what do we want it to do? We want him to rotate for 360 degrees, basically doing 1 spin. And that's how easy it is. And before CSS 3 came along, we could do the same thing, but it took JavaScript and it took a lot of coding and the performance wasn't that great. One of the great things about using CSS for this stuff is that the browser can determine how fast the computer is and can generate a number of keyframes depending on how fast it is. So, for example, I don't know how many keyframes in between Opera uses here, maybe 10 or 15. On a slower computer, like the mobile phones, there could be fewer. On a faster computer, there could be more. But it's a way of doing declarative animation, which makes it easier both for the author and for the computer and in the receiving end. Here's another transition effect. Did you see that? Yeah? So I'm hovering over this element. It's a little shorter than the transition this time, 0.5 seconds. And I'm changing the letter spacing from 0 to 10 pixels when it hovers over. And I rotate it 10 degrees as well. So a lot of the kind of small animation stuff that people have been doing in Flash or JavaScript or some other I'd say not so user-friendly technologies. Maybe I'm harsh now on JavaScript. There's certainly things where you need JavaScript, but ideally you want to use a declarative language, I think. And here's the example. I'm going to show you. Yes, let's go to HTML5. The CSS isn't anything alone. It needs the HTML. They're like brothers. And HTML5 is. There's a lot of development going on now in HTML5. There was a time when we thought that HTML would be abandoned. A lot of people were talking about XML, how that would, in a way, replace HTML. HTML was such a messy world, and we wanted to, clean it up and start with something new. And that, I think, was a good idea from the beginning. At the same time, it's very hard when you have 1 billion users of something. It's very hard to change. It's very hard to change the installed base, and it's very hard to convince authors to go and fix their websites and make it comply with the new standard. So instead of doing XML and XHTML, which was kind of one direction, we said, as browser makers, we said, we'd like to continue doing HTML4, please. But we'd like to add a few more things, because HTML is not just about hypertext documents anymore. It's also about applications. What we've been seeing is that people would like to use web languages to do applications. They'd like to do programming in HTML. They say, often people ask about HTML programming. There isn't really such a thing because HTML isn't a programming language, but JavaScript certainly is a programming language. So we need to change, we need to add a few things to HTML as well in order to do the things people want to do with it. And here's one example. Video. Video is a very common application. We've all seen YouTube. We spend a lot of time there. We want video to be a first-class citizen of the web. It wasn't there from the beginning. From the beginning, there was text, and then we had images. But it's clear that people would like to share videos and watch videos as well. And before the video element was introduced in HTML5, people had to use Flash in order to get this into their web browsers. And Flash, being a proprietary technology, has its problem. Although I'd say Adobe has done a fair job of trying to make it more open and more accessible on many types of devices, I still think it's better to have this done as a one-line element in HTML5. So for this little demo here, I'm using a format called WebM. One person asked me if I was going to say something about that here today. I'm not going to say much about it, but I will underline the importance of having a freely available video format to use. There are approximately 10,000 software patents in the area of video. And those patents have stood in the way for making video available on the web. And just like we cannot use MP3 on the web easily or legally because of the patents, we can't use MPEG-4 either, because the people who own those patents would like to have a share. They'd like to have some royalties when that format is used. So a lot of us said, you know, we can't use MPEG-4, we need something else. Unfortunately, Google stepped up. They spent approximately $100 million buying this company that had a format. They renamed it WebM and made it available for everyone to use. So today Mozilla, Chrome, and Opera supports the WebM video format. And I hope that the other browsers also will be convinced to add this. I think once Wikipedia starts using this for real, I think that this format will be supported by everyone. HTML5 has a lot of other goodies as well. I'm just briefly going to go through some of them. Here's autofocus. Here's title, where you can see select. You can basically suggest things. Here you can set. And this is all declarative. You can see the code on the right there. You can set constraints on it, minimum, maximum values. Here we have an email address. Once the browser knows that it's an email address that is being added, then it can make suggestions. This is probably the coolest. This is about 20 characters, input type equals date, and we can do date selection. So much JavaScript have been wasted on writing different date pickers. You know, when you want to go to a hotel or start something on a certain date, you have to select the date on the web. And it's a lot of work, and they all work differently. And some of them maybe on your phone is not big enough to show because the screen is too small. It's much better to tell the browser, hey, I want the date here. Then the browser can do this. And that's what we're doing here. I think I'm going to skip the part. Let me just be, okay. Just 2 words on testing. I have to be a little quick here. Testing is very important. These specifications do wonderful things, but unless all browsers do it the same way, it's not going to be so fun to be a web author. It's better to do the testing now that the specifications are in development, because both CSS3 and HTML5 are still in development. But you can see on this screenshot that some of them render somewhat differently. So we need to have tests. And this is one example of the kind of tests we've been developing for the web. And now I'm talking really as a web activist rather than a person working for Opera software. Because what we did when Microsoft said they would do another version of their Internet Explorer, we'd had all these problems with Internet Explorer, basically holding back the adoption of CSS. And when they said they were going to do a new version, we made them a challenge. We said, we're going to create an incredibly difficult web page. Let's see if you can decode it correctly. And that was a challenge to Microsoft, but it was also a challenge to the other browser makers. Opera, Mozilla, all of them had problems showing this web page. And this is how it looked. If you do it right, then you get this smiley face. But every pixel, every black or yellow or green thingy on the screen here has a test behind it. So unless you follow the specifications to the letter, you're not going to make it right. And this is what it looked like in IE6. And as you can see, the face is pretty bloody. And I have to admit, we chose that red color to make it look a little worse than it is, maybe, and make it go over. You know, we could have chosen another color, perhaps. And then IE7 came out, and they hadn't fixed all the problems. They fixed a few things. You can now see that it's a face there. It's not really a smile. And then there's something dripping there. I don't know what it is. Then, fantastically, IE8 came along and did it perfectly. And this, I think they did because so many people laughed like you did, right? We basically shamed Microsoft into doing the right thing. You cannot control them. It's a private company. You can't really sue them. There's no laws that say you have to support standards. But you can shame them, and you can laugh, and you say, you know, your browser isn't really up to it, is it? And then they did it. And I think this shows the kind of activist approach we need to have with regards to standards on the web. You need to tell us if our browsers don't work as you want it to. And, you know, make test pages, you know, try us, try Opera, Lucilla, all of us. We need to make sure this thing works. Then I'm going a little bit into the future. Opera reader. Well, actually, I'm going back in time as well. I'm going about 2,000 years back in time, when the Romans, you know, in the Middle East, they had these fantastic documents. Not only in the Middle East, but I'm using that as an example. They had these parchments written in Egypt and other places. The library in Alexandria were filled with parchments. And they were rolls that you had to unroll in order to read. And then the Romans came along and they took their swords and they split those scrolls into pages. And that was very important because once you have pages, you can bind them together. You can put them into a book. And you can put that book on the shelf. And it's much more easy to organize a library once you have books rather than having scrolls. The Romans called it a codex, and it profoundly changed how information was distributed, at least in the Western culture. Now I know that the invention of the book has happened simultaneously in several cultures. It may be something that I should learn about Indian scripts as well. Please tell me afterwards if you know something. But the important thing is that by splitting things into pages, we get a very different presentation. So what we're doing here in Opera, in this experimental build, is we're taking away the scroll bar. We're saying we don't need the scroll bar anymore. We can go to the next page here without using a scroll bar. This is a paged presentation. And here I'm using a mouse to do it. If I were on a tablet, I could use my finger just to go on to the next page. Here's an example where I can achieve a very traditional newspaper-like layout, where I have several columns of text where it flows, and then I have an image that spans across two columns, and it's put up into the corner. And this is an HTML document. You can see it there, HTML, right? And there's no scroll bar here, and I go to the next page by dragging it over, or pressing page down. And this works well on tablets. I also think it will work well on TVs. On TVs, you have a remote control, and you probably have a button called Next Page already, or an arrow you can use. If you try to control a scroll bar with a remote control, it doesn't really work so well. So I think we can achieve some of the same benefits that the Roman achieved by splitting things into pages on the web as well. And then look at this. When I get to the end of the article, I'm still on e1.html up here. And then I continue on, and now I got to e2.html. So what happened there was that the article had a sense of where it belongs in the surroundings. It has a sense of what the next article is, what the previous article is, and what's above it. So I can go above, for example, here now. I can get back to where I was. Right? So I no longer had to click on links to navigate on the web. I can do a page-based navigation. And you can do some wonderful, you can do some pretty amazingly beautiful presentation using this. Again, we're only using CSS and HTML here. We have a classic English tale for children, and this has been available on the web for a long time. All the copyright has expired on this text. Still, I think not very many people have read this from the web. People have used books, because when you use a book, when you sit with a child on your lap, then turning the page is an event in itself. You wonder, or the child wonder, you know, what's going to be on the next page? Are you going to have a figure there, or is it going to be text? So you can get some of that same event, a set of events, if you use these pages. So I was very inspired by this children's book thing. So I wrote a little children's book myself. Can I read it to you? Yeah? Okay. You know about trolls?
Yeah.
Trolls? Yes. You know, troll is one of the very few words that has made its way from the Norwegian language into English over the last 20 years. And that's because of the internet. Because On the internet, we have these trolls, these people who are, always creating problems. Now, trolls in Norwegian is something that's been with us for a much longer time. It's part of our mythology. These trolls live in the mountains, and they're not always good, but some are nice actually. They may not look as nice, but they're smiley, and some are more nasty. Okay. So now we're beyond CSS. We're now into HTML5 and JavaScript. This shows one of the things that we can do in modern browsers. We can actually make it discover what kind of things are available, whether it's a GPS receiver, whether it's a location, whether it's a camera, some kind of 3D device. We need to evolve HTML and the web into a place where we can do the same things as the apps have been doing for some time now. If you're on a tablet and you can write an app and get access to the camera. And the web hasn't quite been there. We're probably a year or two behind, but we're doing it, and it's happening. And once we get it, it's going to run in all the browsers, on all sorts of devices, not just tablets, but also on desktop computers, laptops, phones, and TV, etc. So this is just one example of where we are heading with this technology. Okay, I don't have much time left. I will quickly skip the code that shows how to do that. It's very simple. Again, it's a few lines of CSS in order to make that page presentation. But page media is more than screens, though. Page media is also traditional books. This is one of the oldest books in Europe, one of the first books that were printed when Gutenberg invented the printing press. He printed the Bible. It's a fantastically beautiful book that was done in the 1400s, 1470s. People still admire the typography here. And if you look closely, you can see that he actually put the hyphenation marks on the outside. You see that? The little dashes to show that the word is split. He put it outside to get a very straight line, to have the justification, perfect justification, very visual justification. This is something that CSS still cannot do. But we're getting closer. We can do more book stuff in CSS now. There's page presentation as in printed books have other requirements. First, you need footnotes, very common. You need to be able to do page numbers. Let's see, where's the page number? Page number is here. You need to do multi-column layout. You need to be able to have a table of contents where you show, the next page, the next chapter, where does it start? It starts on page 10 maybe. You can't type those numbers in because you don't know where they are. Because maybe by selecting a different font, you have a different number of formatted pages. So that has to be dynamic. So you need a little bit of code to do all that. We weren't quite sure whether CSS was up to this task. But I got a chance to try this out when I wrote a book about CSS, along with Bert Voss. We did this book, and the third edition, we said, we're going to try this and make sure we can print real books using HTML and CSS. And if we can't do it, we've kind of failed. If we can only do screens, then the web doesn't hold as much as it could potentially have. So we had to add a few things, but the result is pretty good. You can do a fairly advanced presentation using HTML and CSS. Some of the tricks that I have told you, and some of the other ones that are you still have to discover for yourself. But it's again, fairly easy stuff. You can do a lot of things in 10 to 20 lines of code, and the HTML is also very simple. That's one word that goes with this, these specifications. Simplicity has always been the goal. I have a couple of copies of this book if you'd like it afterwards. I don't want to carry these home with me. They're quite heavy, but they make a nice sound when you drop them on the floor. That's something a web page can't do. All right. minutes left. Opera Mini. Opera Mini, most of you have it in your pockets already. It's been a tremendous success for us. I have some statistics here. My statistics is not up to date, but it shows we have seen incredible user growth over the last years, and the growth seems to continue. These are numbers from a year back, from January 2010. Russia was the top country in terms of usage. Second was Indonesia. Third was India. I'm happy to report now that India has now become number 2. You have bypassed Indonesia and none of the other countries. Do you know the other countries? You know 5? Ukraine, that's right. Yeah, I know, you know. How's that go? Nigeria. Vietnam. Brazil. You're great. You're great. One country I'd like to mention, which is number 17 on this list, Egypt. Egypt. We've also seen incredible growth all over the Middle East, and Egypt has had, you know, it made it into the top 20 there. It is number 17. And since the traffic goes through our service, we can follow. We can see what kind of pages that the Egyptians are reading and what kind of handsets they're using. And that was especially interesting during the Egyptian Revolution, where we saw that suddenly we had a huge spike in the use of Opera Mini in this period. This is just before the revolution. And then it went dark. When the regime tried to stop the internet, they interestingly enough, they turned off the internet, but they forgot about turning off Opera Mini. Because Opera Mini goes through our servers, you know, it doesn't go through the normal network. So sometimes governments forget to turn off Opera Mini. Don't tell them, okay? So we were still, for a few days, running here. And then it went dark. And then it came back again here. And we could also see what kind of, I don't have time to go into that now, but we can kind of follow what kind of newspapers people were reading. Did they read the government-friendly newspapers or the more opposition-friendly newspapers? The conclusion from all this is that technology is increasingly a part of society all over. I could show the same kind of numbers for Japan when the earthquake and the tsunami hit there. And of course, these are all huge events. Some of them are catastrophes, often with a huge human cost. And I don't want to turn this into basically a game of statistics. But I do think that technology overall has played a positive role in all of this. The fact that we can get access to news, the fact that we can see our friends on Facebook and see if they're okay, has actually made it easier to get over some of these huge events that are occurring. This is the usage numbers for Opera Mini. We run on thousands of phones. I think in the history of computer science, I don't think you can find any one application that runs on more platforms, more devices than Opera. We run on everything, of course, Linux, Windows, the normal ones, and then we have a bunch of all these, you know, Nintendo Wii, all the phones, etc., etc. I'd like to sit down and make that list one day. My last 60 seconds, I'll talk about open data. I'm running over time now. I know you have lectures tomorrow. Give me 2 minutes, okay? Now I'm not talking about the technology anymore. I'm talking about governments and how we want them to use it. It was encouraging to see when I landed in Mumbai, the immigration form, they started out listing 10 websites. They said, welcome to India first. And then here are the websites of some of the governments that you may need to consult. And that shows that it's, you know, they're taking it seriously. They know how they have to deal with this technology, and a lot of people in the government all over the world are trying to do the right thing by distributing information that's useful to people. But there still can be improvements all over. I think that's true any place. And as users, we need to make sure that they do publish the right information, that they make it available for free. If they start charging for it, it doesn't work. Here are some of the screens that governments in various places have done. And this is UN, which also has a lot of information. I'm not sure about the situation in India. For example, one question to ask Are the laws of your country available online?
Yes. Yes.
For free?
Yes.
That's good. That's a good thing. That wasn't the case when I came to CERN in 1993. And one of the first things I did there was actually to put the Norwegian laws online. The Norwegian laws existed in electronic form at the time, and they could even be reached over the internet, but the government charged people money for it. And they said, okay, so this is kind of a high-end service for lawyers, and lawyers are happy to pay $50 to have access to the laws per month. We said, as taxpayers, we don't think that's right. We think laws should be available for free. And it wasn't clear whether that was legal or not to put the laws on. But we started typing in the laws. We scanned pages and made them available in HTML. And since I was the only member of the project who were sitting outside the country, so I was given the job of publishing this. Because if they published it in Norway, you know, maybe the police would show up one day. So I was sitting there at CERN, you know, while doing CSS and other things. I published the laws of Norway on CERN servers. And I didn't tell anyone at CERN about it. But one day Tim came by, you know, we were sharing office, so he had to pass me on his way. And he came by and saw me and said, Hakon, what are you doing? Well, I'm actually publishing the laws of Norway from CERN's computers. And he said, do you need more disk space? I think I'll end there. It shows that technologists have to have a sense of how we're going to use the technology as well. And I hope that all of you will be on the web for many years to come and that we'll find all the information we need there. Thank you so much. We have a little more time actually, and we have time for a few questions and answers if there are some. There's one in the back. Sorry, yeah, I can't hear you.
Browsers today are becoming more powerful. Like you showed like page which is taking video input, and it showed your face, like that troll thing. So, doesn't it have security implications? Because if someone sends corrupt HTML, CSS pages, which could take which could take snapshots of your, which could take a snapshot without your approval. So, it has a big, powerful browsers may have security implications, right? Like, it may access the data on the computer. Like JavaScript is restricted to access data on a computer. So there are some limitations in browsers. So, like, what's the scope of this?
So the question has to do with security. Are there security implications of running HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in the browser? You may have had a very specific question that I didn't catch, but I'll address the general question. Yes, there are security implications. For example, one of the first attacks we had through CSS was that you could check the color of some text. And because you could change the color of the text based on whether you have visited the site or not, people could actually detect what sites you have been to. And with video, you can probably make some of the same kind of things, check whether a video file is available in the cache. That certainly is a security certainly has security implications that needs to be addressed. Now, there are many people that are concerned about this, and I think that good technical solutions are in place. But I must confess that personally, I'm not a security guy. I find security quite boring. But it's necessary, so I'm happy that some people smarter than me are looking into it. Any more? Yeah? Can you speak clearly?
Yeah, what do you think about the SOPA Act that's being debated at the US Congress right now?
SOPA, yes. Yeah. You're referring to the American law. The question is about the SOPA law, which is going now through the US Congress, what we think about it. I think that is a very problematic law. Basically what it will do is that if somebody finds a file on your website that they think are copyrighted or shouldn't be there for some reason, they can go to the authorities or go to the people who provide internet access and say, I want this website to be blocked. So Facebook, for example, or Google, or some other huge site, My Opera, we have millions of users. If one of our users puts something there which shouldn't be there, basically they can force us to close the whole website, which is a catastrophe. So I think the law is it's not proportional. It's giving much too much power to anyone who has a claim of something. So I think we should not have that law in place. Of course, it's only US now, but we also know that the US is pressuring other countries to have similar kinds of laws. The good news in all this is that the whole computer industry, everyone basically that does software and services on the internet, have said, no, we don't want this law. So I have good hopes that it won't come into effect, but we don't know for sure yet. So it's good to hear that you're aware of the issues and hopefully can support the fight against it. There's another question? Yeah?
But now that CSS have pushed the limits of publishing books and everything, so does that mean that LaTeX and other publishing systems, they'll be obsolete?
It's a great question. The question is, can we now forget about LaTeX? LaTeX, you remember LaTeX? You're still using it? Yeah? Donald Knuth, fantastic mathematician, created TeX in the 80s and 90s in order to do scientific publishing. And I think we can say that his math stuff, we still can't do all the math that TeX can do. So for scientific publishing, I think it still has a role. For other types of publishing, like normal books and screen-based publications, I think the only answer is HTML and CSS. And if we can't do it in HTML and CSS, we can fix it. Actually, there's many people working on doing this in web-based languages like MathML as well. I don't think they're quite completed, so I don't think it's finished yet. But one day we will be able to do all of it. But still, I think Donald Knuth and all the people behind TeX still deserves a big thank you, because they showed it was possible to do publishing without sitting in front of a WYSIWYG computer. There were basically two lines of electronic publishing. One is the WYSIWYG computer, where you see, what you see is what you get. I don't think that works for the web, because the web has so many different screen types and so many different user situations. Whereas the code-based approach, where you write LaTeX or TeX or some other quite compressed code, is actually similar to CSS in many ways. CSS is simpler. I'd say TeX is kind of the assembly language of publishing. We've tried to make things more abstract, more like LaTeX, but you can't jump into executable code in CSS. So it's simpler and more safe in many ways. So I hope to see this as kind of the next generation, but I'm not the one to tell the history there. That will be somebody else's job.
Excuse me. How does Opera Turbo speed up internet browsing?
Sorry, I didn't catch your question.
How does Opera Turbo speed up internet browsing? The Opera Turbo you play.
How we speed up internet browsing?
Opera Turbo.
Sorry.
The Opera Turbo feature in your browser.
How does Opera Turbo speed
Turbo. Oh, Opera Turbo, exactly. Okay, so I talked about Opera Mini, which is one way we speed up browsing from phones. And Opera Mini and Opera Turbo, which is what you're asking about, are quite similar. But if you look at the very basics, they're quite different. Opera Mini does a good job of compression by using a proprietary binary code underneath. So if you look at what crosses the wire in Opera Mini, it's binary. That makes it possible to really squeeze things together. Opera Turbo still relies on standard HTML. We compress the images, for example. We squeeze them together. We squeeze the HTML by doing zip-like compression on the line level at the HTTP level. So we're using all kinds of tricks there as well. So we're able to get compression ratios which are close to Opera Mini, but not quite there. Another reason for sticking to Opera Mini on these handheld devices is that it's more compact. It's easier to parse our binary structure than it is to parse the HTML that comes out of Opera Turbo. But for a user, it doesn't have to matter. They should all be the same. And I think that Opera Turbo will be important in places where bandwidth is still scarce. And I think that's the case in many parts of India, where you either have very slow connection speeds or you pay for your connection. And if you do so, if you have a laptop with a very constrained environment, then it makes a lot of sense to use Opera Turbo. So I'm glad you asked that. I should have talked about it.
Hello, sir. So actually, as we saw the CSS as evolved to CSS3, HTML as evolved to HTML5, now we are having the modern browsers. So can sites can track the users, they can track their surfing experience. So what things are going in this direction, keeping the privacy of users and anonymity of the users?
I had to make a confession, Peter. I'm not very good at understanding what people say in India when they speak to me. Can you repeat the last? I got the first part, and I'm trying really hard.
So, okay, sir. Can I repeat question?
Privacy
when we close our account, then also Facebook was able to track our experience, track our browsing experience. So what things are going in this direction? To secure the privacy of user.
Yeah, I think it's a very important topic that you raised, security and privacy, and we certainly had to make sure that we address those topics. I think the best way to address those topics is to use it wide scale. Some people think that security is best done by having secret specifications, by having binary protocols. In general, I don't think that's true. I think the way we're developing those specifications very much in the open. If you want to participate in the development of CSS, there's a mailing list for it. And there's another one for HTML5. By giving them the review beforehand, and as well testing all the browsers once they come out, I think we can do a pretty good job of making sure that at least the line-to-line, the computer-to-computer communication is fairly safe. Of course, we can never insure ourselves against huge breaches. If somebody breaks into Facebook's registry of users and their passwords and gets hold of those files, that's nothing we can be sure won't happen. We had to rely on the internal procedures in those companies. But I think as far as protocols goes, I think the web protocols, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, I don't see how we can make it better than it is.
You'll have to cut it, sorry. Thank you, sir, for a wonderful lecture you have given. I'm sure all of you would have enjoyed it. It was an awesome experience having Mr. Hakon over here, and I hope all of you would come next year as well and grace us with your presence. Techfest 2013. Thank you. And if anyone has any other questions, you can contact Mr. Hakon afterwards, after the lecture. Thank you.